What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. This program aims to show you the other side of the story, normally the sides that are ignored by mainstream media. And today we focus on China-Australia relationship. And joining me today is Robbie Barwick. He's the research director for Australian Citizen Party. Robbie, welcome.
Thank you, Jingjing.
So before we continue our discussion, can you tell us more about your party, your job, so our viewers can have a better understanding about your work?
Yes, well, I've worked with the Australian Citizens Party for nearly 30 years. I'm the research director. So the Citizens Party is one of the minor parties, political parties in Australia. We actually don't have anyone elected into Parliament, though there's an election on right now, which will be, the voting day is on the 21st of May. I'm a candidate in that election for the Senate of the Federal Parliament to represent the state of Victoria, where I'm from. I'm here in Melbourne. Even though we don't, and hopefully we'll get elected, but it's probably doubtful. It's quite a challenge to get elected into the Australian Parliament. And you've got to get a lot of media coverage, and we don't get very much of that. However, we have a very strong base of support around Australia, people who are really committed to our policies and our ideas, because we're a party that thinks long term about what's in the best interest of Australia and what we need to do for our country. And we do it in a way where we're not influenced by vested interests. So we don't receive money from corporations or other organisations. We just get funded by the Australian people who like our ideas. And the best way to think of our ideas, and they're mainly economic ideas, is what can the government do, considering I want to get into government, what can the government do as a government to create the framework in which creative individuals and entrepreneurs can flourish in an economy. And in Australia, we've gone way too much down what's called the neoliberal ideological path, where the government role has been reduced and it's all left up to the private sector. We didn't used to be like that. And we look at a country like China, where we think that your balance is much better. And you're the most successful. China's the most successful economy in the world. And what we particularly like about China and like to highlight is the role of your state banks, your large state banks, in making sure that the right investment goes into the right places of the economy. And we used to do that here, Jingjing. And in fact, your country, China, probably learned some of it from us, from Japan, from the United States. We all used to do it. We gave it up. We stopped doing it. And our economy has suffered, and suffered badly. Now, even though it suffered, one of the best parts of our economy is our trade with China. We have a very good trading relationship with China, and it's in our favour. We have a massive surplus with the trade with China in our favour, around 70 billion Australian dollars a year. That is huge. By comparison, our trade with the United States is in the United States' favour, about $30 billion. That's money we lose every year by trading with the United States. With China, we profit $70 billion a year. We don't have a big population, as you know, right? 25 million people. So $70 billion is very, very significant for our economy. The overall trade is much bigger than that, two-way trade. So that's good. But we think, okay, what can we do to bring back with the use of public banks to invest in the economy, more productive industries, so we generate more wealth here. So that's what we promote, and our supporters really support that. And we get a lot of influence. We've got a lot of collaborators among all the political parties, and hopefully we'll get some of our policies passed. So that's what I focus on as the research director. However, there is a negative side to what we've had to focus on in recent times, which also relates to how we think long term, because we are extremely alarmed, and it's why I'm on this show, about what's happened to our country's relationship with China. And in fact, to the point where we're alarmed that we're on a path to war. And that used to be unthinkable that could ever happen, right? Why would you go to war with your biggest and best trading partner? But that's exactly what has happened rather quickly. There's been a rather quick turnaround just in the last few years. And our party, I can say this, is the most forceful and most outspoken in Australia in opposing that. We are not in lockstep, with Uncle Sam in the United States and John Bull in the United Kingdom. We think Australia should be an independent country. We exist here in the Asia Pacific. We should be friends with our neighbours in the Asia Pacific. This is our region. We shouldn't be looking at our neighbours as if somehow they're all a threat to us, and that we need the United States and the United Kingdom for security. And in fact, if we stop doing that, we would actually get more security because we'd get on better in the region, and there wouldn't be these tensions that can easily be misinterpreted as threats, right? So we are fighting very, very hard to change that, and that's been a big part of our work in the last few years. We don't receive Chinese money. We don't receive money from anyone except Australian citizens. We've never received money from foreign governments in 30 years of existence, more than 30 years of existence. We are not obligated to anybody to do this. We're doing this because it's right.
So let's talk about the recent big news, because China and Solomon Islands recently signed this security cooperation framework. And this framework will allow both countries to work in areas like disaster response, humanitarian aid, development assistance, and to maintain social order. And this cooperation between the two countries received global attention. In other words, it received backlash from several countries. For example, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, this is what he said. Let me read a few lines here. He said, if the agreement allowed a Chinese military base on the Pacific Island nation, that would be a red line for his government. And Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrew also said China is very likely to put troops in the Solomon Islands after signing the agreement. But in fact, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister repeatedly reassured that signing this agreement with China does not mean he is inviting a Chinese military base in his country. He's not planning to do that at all. And also China said it many times that this cooperation with the Solomon Islands does not target any third parties. Still, we see several politicians in Australia, in New Zealand, or in the United Kingdom, including media, they are all hyping up the threats from China, from the agreement.
First of all, you have to discount it a little bit because we're in an election. And the craziest thing about this election right now is how both sides, the two major parties, the two big ones, see it as popular to act in a hostile way towards China. And so they are both hyping this, and it's unconscionable and unforgivable. But I'll talk about why more in a minute. There's been this, the public opinion has been well and truly turned against China, and they're trying to capitalize on that. So if the election wasn't on, maybe they'd be slightly more measured in what they're saying. But I'm only saying maybe and slightly, because I'm not even convinced of that right now. The reaction to this Solomon Islands deal is extreme, it's hypocritical, and it's nuts. So just on the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who I regard as a despicable person. I hope he loses this election. I think he's the worst leader we've ever had. But he's being blamed for this Solomon Islands deal, Jing, as if it's his fault that the Solomon Islands and China have signed a deal. Now, think about that. That is a colonial mentality. What's it got to do with us? Seriously, what has it got to do with us? It's not, I will defend him because it's not his fault. It's none of our business, ultimately, right? Yeah. But they're claiming it is our business. Now, granted, it's in our neighborhood, right? So we have an interest in it for sure, but it's not our business in that colonial way, the way they're trying to make out. There's one country that is expressing opinion, and it's absolutely not their business at all, and that's the United Kingdom. And I would like all the countries in the Asia Pacific to all say as one, butt out. Get out of here, United Kingdom. You screwed up the world for hundreds of years. You're not welcome. Take your rubber ducky aircraft carrier and don't come back. I wouldn't say that necessarily in those terms to the United States because it's part of the Pacific, right? But it doesn't, it's trying to the United States is a long way away, right? And it is, so I'm not going to say it has no interest, but its role here is really why Australia is acting the way it is, right? So there was a journalist. Most of the mainstream media has played a terrible role in this in Australia, but one journalist a couple of nights ago on one of our main shows asked a politician if they were aware that the United States last year did a deal with the Federated States of Micronesia to increase its military presence, did a deal with some of those smaller states in the North Pacific to increase its military presence and add installations. And the journalist said, so if anything, if China is doing a deal with Solomons that will give it a base, if anything, that's a response to this increased activity by the United States. And then he said to this politician, are you of the view that only America is allowed to have a military presence in a part of the world like this? And the politician knew that the question trapped them, because to say yes is extreme hypocrisy. But the politician stammered and stumbled and whatever, and then basically essentially said yes, because they said, oh, we share America's values, right? And that's actually not where they're coming from. Her party, which is the opposition party, if they get in, they'll be the new government if they win this election. Their foreign spokesman a few years ago said something very interesting about Vanuatu, because a couple of years ago there was a precursor to this drama now when Australian media reported that Vanuatu, which is a bit further south than the Solomon Islands, had a port that was very deep. And an American naval officer had visited Vanuatu and noticed how deep the port was and said, oh, we could fit an aircraft carrier in here. And because that American naval officer made that observation publicly, Australian journalists said, oh, China helped deepen the port. This must be planned for a naval base. This must be. And Vanuatu said, no, it's not. And the Chinese said, what are you talking about? Right? Oh, no, it has to be. And there was a similar flap over that back then. And this politician from the Labor Party, Richard Marles, said in an interview, he said, the reason we have to be concerned is because America expects us, Australia, to police the Pacific. He actually said, we are doing America's bidding in the Pacific. That is our job. Well, I'm a patriotic Australian who thinks we should be independent, Jing Jing, and I don't think that should be our job at all. All the Solomons has done is sign a security deal with China, which is very similar to a security deal they have with Australia. They can ask us to go and assist them for, weather disasters, local insurrections, etc. We've done it before. They can ask us to do that as well. It's just that in recent years, our help and our attitude to them has been less than impressive. China's attitude to them has been very helpful. And the Solomons has made an independent decision saying, we want to have the ability to call in China's help if we need it. That is not a military base. The Prime Minister Sogavare is insisting it's not a military base, but our politicians are responding here as if they've let the United States down. And that is bad. That is very bad. In fact, the United States sent in Kurt Campbell a few days ago, their Pacific guru. They sent him in there to heavy the Solomon Islands government. They have a colonial imperial mindset, and we're assisting them. And I have one more comment to make about it. Now, everyone knows, compare this discussion to what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. Our government has been over the top in its condemnation of Russia for invading Ukraine. They have been so moralizing. It's as if we, Australia, are pure as the driven snow. We've never done anything to other countries, when in fact we have participated in every American and British war for 100 years. And of course, the latter one, World War II was justified, but most of the latter ones, absolutely not, including the atrocity of the 21st century, which is the Iraq War. We were in there. We are guilty of that. We act as if it didn't even happen. And we've been condemning Russia like crazy. And basically, we've been saying that Russia's position that Ukraine is its red line, because if Ukraine has a deal with NATO, that is an existential threat to Russia, and therefore that cannot happen. We've been saying Russia's position is illegitimate. Yet we are now saying that China is the Solomon Islands is our red line, even though it's not on our border. Ukraine is 1 millimeter from Russia's border. This is 2,000 kilometers away over an ocean, yet somehow that is our red line. It is completely hypocritical. And in fact, the language of our politicians has absolutely justified everything that Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine this year.
Exactly. I mean, to me, it's surprising, it's shocking how this hypocrisy revealed in just several weeks. Because several weeks ago, all of these Western nations are saying Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country. They can choose whatever alliance they want to join. They shouldn't be a backyard of any country. If they want to join NATO, they should join NATO. They have their own, like Russia's, the security concern is just Russia's propaganda. They don't have legitimate security concerns. Solomon Islands is an independent country. They can choose whoever they want to work with. And now Australia is saying, oh, whoa, no, you cannot join. It's our red line that your country cannot work with other country. But the thing is, if you look at the media reports, you probably think that China is already establishing a military base in Solomon Islands. But actually, no, it's not happening. Nothing is being said about military base on Solomon Islands. And also, I think one politician is saying Solomon Islands is Australia's Cuban Missile Crisis, which is not really relevant, I think, because Solomon Islands is like 2,000 kilometers away from Australia. Cuba is 200 kilometers away from United States. So it's like, well, to me, it's quite funny how things completely flipped in just several weeks.
Well, I think the role of hypocrisy in foreign policy is extreme at the moment, and I'm over it. And I'm going. We have to call it out. I actually couldn't tell you what the total mood in the actual country is. But among the politicians, because this election's on, they've just gone bananas. But I just give you a bit of setup. 10 years ago, when our organisation and this late Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser was saying, look, strategically, the way we're acting in this part of the world is going to lead to war. People didn't want to hear that. They were saying, what are you talking about? Rubbish. At a government level, all the politicians were full of praise for China. But it was contradictory to their subservience to the United States. But we were signing deals with China, free trade deals with China. Like I said, your president came here in 2015. We signed a comprehensive strategic partnership. When the Belt and Road was announced, we were gushing in our praise for it. Gushing. America told us not to sign up to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We did anyway, right? Because we were enjoying the fact that here's a trade relationship that's making us a lot of money. Right, we are getting a lot of wealth from this trade relationship. The wine growers, the lobster fishers, the beef producers, right, were enjoying these massive markets in China. And it was wonderful. So we're saying, look, that is really good. But because the same politicians are so subservient to the United States and the United Kingdom, and they've got these strategies that are unfolding in our part of the world, like the Asia pivot, this is going to lead to war. And people didn't want to hear it. In the last few years, as the tone changed, right, and suddenly there's all this hyping up about China, and every politician just started buying into that. And the language changed, the rhetoric changed, no longer a friendly face towards China. We're more urgently warning about war, and people still didn't want to hear it because war is unthinkable. Well, this week, in this election campaign, our politicians are talking about war. They've normalised it. Peter Dutton, the Defence Minister, said on Monday, he was asked what we're going to do about the so-called threat of China's expansionism that the Solomon Islands deal represents. And he said, well, to secure peace, you must prepare for war, right? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they announce a draft tomorrow. When I say a draft, I mean conscription. Call up all the young men. You got to be prepared to fight. This is the climate. He said that this week, and then the Labor Party, because there's election on, they effectively backed up the claim that the Solomons is some kind of red line or an absolutely strategic threat to Australia, even though it's got nothing to do with us. They backed that up. And I'm thinking, this is madness. These politicians somehow see votes. They see it as popular to threaten war at the moment. What was unthinkable when we first started warning about it has suddenly become popular. And this is very, very alarming. Chinese viewers, don't overreact to it, please. Don't. We need to turn it around, right? We really do. We need to. Our party is being very outspoken, warning of the consequences of this. We must turn this around. We must get people to actually take stock. Do you know what this means, right? A war with China is a war of annihilation. And in fact, all we would be doing is allowing ourselves to be used as a proxy for the United States, like Ukraine is at the moment, right? The United States would be very careful to make sure it doesn't get into a shooting war with China, because they're both nuclear powers and that can quickly escalate into a nuclear war. But they would happily let Australia get into a shooting war with China. And one of the things I like pointing out about the United States, Jingjing, there's 70,000 bridges in America that are in danger of collapsing without warning, like one did a few weeks ago, one famously did about 10 years ago, just like that. America has not been spending money on its own infrastructure and all those things. They've got incredible poverty, mass homelessness. You can't walk through any city in the United States without seeing homeless people everywhere, massive drug problem. It is a country that's in decay. It's the decline and fall of the Roman Empire all over again. And they could turn it around if they went back to their own roots. If they realize that, hang on, what China's doing is successful, we once did. Let's invest in ourselves again. Let's build the infrastructure we need to, right? They could enjoy a much better life, but they'd have to let go of this idea that somehow they've got to be the sole superpower, because they don't have to be. They'll always be a powerful country. But there's no this idea one country gets to dictate to the world. They've lost the moral authority. They don't have that anymore, if they ever had it. But World War II was they played a very important role, but they were the most powerful economy. They've lost that, right? Stop seeing China as a threat and go look after your own affairs. You'll stop being afraid of China, and your economy will improve massively. And Australia can take the same approach as well. So let's hope we can get that message through to people in time, Ginger.
So I was reading the Solomon newspaper's report on this, because right after China and Solomon Islands signed this agreement, and U.S. top officials visited Solomon Islands, and the local newspaper Solomon Star said that basically United States distanced itself from Solomon Islands in the past 80 years after World War II. They never sent top-level officials to visit that country, and now they send a delegation of top-level officials to visit this country. And local newspaper is let me read a few lines of it. So the Solomon Star described that the United States had totally forgotten Solomon Islands for the past 80 years. Actually, it distanced Solomon Islands after World War II, which left hazardous chemical wastes, military hardware that is still threatening the life of people in many parts of the country.
It's true, and I've actually got relatives from there. My sister is married to someone from the Solomon Islands, so I actually, of all the places in the Pacific, I've got a bit more of a connection there to anywhere else. And it's a wonderful place, and they're wonderful people. These Pacific nations have a sort of a straightforward economic outlook. It's in their interest to get on with everybody. They don't want to be drawn into conflicts, but they also, it's called, why it's called the Solomon Islands? Because it's so rich. It's like it was compared, when it was discovered by Europeans, it was compared to King Solomon's mythical mines, right, with all this wealth. And it's in this sort of rather larger archipelago to the east of Papua New Guinea. And that whole region, starting in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and going to the Solomon Islands, there's an island in the middle called Bougainville. It's incredibly rich in resources, right? Incredibly rich. And that's where, external powers pay attention and are interested. But you're right. The United States fought a massive battle there in World War II. It was one of the biggest battles of World War II, the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is the biggest island in the Solomon Islands. Very important part of the fight back against the Japanese. But then, they weren't paying attention. But I have to say this about the gentleman who visited. I mentioned his name earlier, Kurt Campbell, the American representative. He is the architect of Barack Obama's policy called the Asia Pivot. And I regard this decision in 2011 as the fateful decision that set all this in train, this deterioration of relationship in train. Because essentially what the Asia Pivot was when Obama became president and had a bit of time to got over dealing with the financial crisis, etc. The Americans said, well, we no longer regard the Middle East as a priority, after they had literally stuffed it up, like destroyed it, turned the Middle East into a hellscape, and North Africa. I mean, it was the same year as the Libya intervention, which is one of the biggest crimes, second only to the destruction of Iraq, right? After doing that, Obama said, well, that's no longer our priority. Our priority is now the Asia Pacific, and we're going to pivot to Asia. That's what it's called, the Asia Pivot. What that meant in practice, America deployed 60% of its total military firepower in the Asia Pacific, targeted at one country, China. China had not started building up the islands in the South China Sea. They hadn't started that yet. That started in 2013. This was happening in 2011. And it was the Americans saying, we are looking at the rise of China, and they're on their way to eclipse us, right, economically, and we will not tolerate that. Not because they had a right to, they just claimed that right in this pivot decision. And that's what set this in train. And this Kurt Campbell was the architect of that. So 10 years later, or 11 years later, Solomons has signed this deal with China. Who goes down there to visit the Solomon Islands? The same Kurt Campbell. But I must say, what the Solomons decision means that despite 10 years now of the Asia Pivot, the countries in Asia, the Asia Pacific, including the Solomons, are still wanting to do deals with China. So America can put even more military power in. That's not how China's doing business. It's doing business by doing business. And the countries of the Asia Pacific want to do business with the most successful economy in the Asia Pacific. There's only one country in the whole Asia Pacific that's prepared to shoot itself in the foot to please the Americans, and that's my country. And that's why I'm outspoken against it.
And I noticed something in some media reports. They say Washington, D.C. believes a free and fair election could result in a new government that not only abrogates the security deal with China, but switches back to Taiwan. Narratives, all these quotes on several media, sounds like to me that the United States are planning another regime-changing games in Solomon Islands, like they did before in many parts of the world, right? Because your country have a friendly relationship with our enemy, or especially with China. We're gonna support with the opposition parties, opposition leaders, and we're gonna overthrow you. The leader who is friendly with China replaced with a puppet, and who just blindly follow our orders. What do you think?
That is exactly on the cards. But the Prime Minister, Sogavari, even before signing this deal, in response to the riots last year, in which some Chinese shopkeepers were killed in those riots, and that's one of the reasons that this is a security deal. He said that he said a foreign country is already stirring up those riots in this island called Malta. He actually accused a foreign. He didn't name it, but he accused it. And we know who he was talking about. He was talking about the United States then, right? So he's part of this. He's already seen what the United States is trying to do to his country, and now he's signed this deal. And I can tell from the Australian press, there's been lots of interviews with opposition figures in the Solomon Islands. There's a lot of money that's going to be poured in there, and they'll say, "Oh, see, we if they have free and fair elections, they're going to turn to the United States. There won't be anything free and fair about them. The meaning of free and fair in that context will mean as much as Fox News is fair and balanced in the United States, right? There was this famous English author, George Orwell, who wrote 1984, right? And he called it newspeak. You can make words mean the opposite. And that's what free and fair elections would mean in that context. It wouldn't be free, it wouldn't be fair, it'll be rigged. And if that doesn't work, they'll have a coup. Because at the end of the day, Solomon's this little country, and they will not care about the consequences. If anything, they'd like to make an example of them, right? And this is wrong. And a country like Australia, if we believe in fairness, Australia likes to say that we believe in called a fair go. If we believe in that, if we believe in the principle of sovereignty, we've got to look at the world in a very different way. We are a former prime minister, Malcolm Fraser, who was prime minister from 1975 to 1982, at the height of the Cold War, who before he became prime minister was a defense minister, and he sent young Australian men to the Vietnam War, right? He was a hard politician, very, very hard man, right? In the latter years of his life, he took it upon himself to oppose our relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom. And he wrote a book called Dangerous Allies. And because his attitude was, when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, that everyone should have dropped those institutions and obstacles to peace and cooperated, right? But instead, America expanded NATO. The Americans created this doctrine called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which said we're not going to tolerate the rise of a rival economic or military power. There has to be a unipolar world, and we have to be the sole superpower. And he saw that was not what he thought the Cold War had been important to fight, but he thought that's not how you handle victory. We should be looking for ways to say, okay, there's an opportunity here for the whole world to cooperate around the important things so that everyone can have peace and everyone can have a rising living standard, etc. Right? And so he admired the economic rise of China, but he saw that Australia, including in his era, had just been dragged by the nose into every British and American war. And that's why he wrote this book, Dangerous Allies. And the kicker on the book, listen to this, he said, the blurb was, Australia needs the United States. Sorry, Australia needs to be allied to the United States for security. But Australia only needs security because it is allied to the United States. Right? It is the cause of our insecurity because of this way it acts on the world stage. So I think we should be a friend to the United States, Jingjing. And as a friend, we should say to the United States, stop acting that way. And we should stop acting that way as well. There's no need for this kind of behavior. One of the things that happened with Barack Obama's Asia pivot is he excluded, he didn't want China to be in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Yet China started the Asia and Infrastructure Investment Bank. We joined it, and then America told us off for joining it and said, we didn't want you to join that. China invited the whole world to join it. China announced the Belt and Road Initiative and invited the whole world to join it, including the United States, because that's the way China operates. And if the United States is so worried that China may, go overboard on some of its things, it could be in there as the the only economic power to match China, and working together and make sure that the projects are balanced. It could do that. Instead, it's chosen to demonize these positive infrastructure developments as a threat, right? Just because it doesn't want to change its own system, but still reserve the right to be the sole superpower. And stupid countries like us have to go along with that. Well, politicians in the major parties are stupid. We're not. So we're opposing it, and we want to tell the truth about the Solomon Islands as well.
From your perspective, from an Australian view, because over here, sometimes we see the media reports, but we don't know what the mood really is like in Australia. From your view, what are the factors that contributed to this deterioration of the relationship between the two countries? What are the main reasons? You mentioned before, like the United States is one of the reasons that some certain politicians in Australia is behaving like this. Are there any other contributing factors?
I will go so far as to say that this change in our relationship was a deliberate plan. It didn't happen economically. People set out to do it. And we know who those people are. And without going into all the details, let me just make it simple. The same people that lied and conspired to start the Iraq War, who became very notorious for that. And we got used to this term called the neocons or the neoconservatives. And this was this faction in America, but also in Britain, that actually they created this smokescreen called liberal democracy as a pretext for war, right? But the real agenda was keeping the Anglo-Americans as the sole superpower in the world. That's who the neocons are. That's what they're committed to, maintaining Anglo-American global supremacy, right? Yet, and unfortunately, it's racist because they cannot ever see themselves sharing influence with an Asian country like China. Those networks, and they operate through networks. Those networks did this. Now, there's one in the UK that was particularly influential. A lot of people talk about the United States. Let me tell you about the United Kingdom. There's an organization there called the Henry Jackson Society, and they are evil. And I'll give you an example of their evil. This was a group, it's a British group, but they're named after an American politician, Henry Jackson. That American politician was the mentor for people whose names you're familiar with, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. He was their mentor. He taught them. And those two men, remember what happened in the Bush administration, right? And George Bush was a blithering idiot. Dick Cheney ran that administration, and Donald Rumsfeld ran the invasion. So this British group named themselves after him, the mentor of those two evil Americans. When Libya was invaded, when the Libya intervention happened in 2011, there was a big debate in the UK. And people like Jeremy Corbyn led the debate, the former Labour leader. And the British Prime Minister was sort of reluctant at first and sort of justifying certain ways they were doing it. And then he made this comment. He said, democracy can't be dropped from 10,000 feet. In other words, you can go in and bomb a country, but that doesn't ensure it's going to become a democracy. Anyway, events happened. They did do the intervention, and the British and this Prime Minister, but pushed by this Henry Jackson Society, they pulled it off. They lied to the Russians. They told the Russians, "Oh, this is not going to become an intervention. This is no-fly zone," right? But of course, then it became a regime change because that was the plan all along. And then you remember what happened? The president, Gaddafi, was brutally murdered, right? It's a horrible, horrible atrocity. In 2016, the British Parliament put out a report and said, "Oops, we were wrong. Oops. What we said was lies. Oops." There's no consequences for them, right? Poor Russia gets kicked out of the world for its invasion, but the British can do it. Oops, we'll even do a report about it and say oops, but there's no consequences. But in 2011, after Gaddafi got murdered, one of the founders of this Henry Jackson Society said, "See," he wrote it, "democracy can be dropped from 10,000 feet. In other words, we can bomb countries to smithereens to turn them into democracies. That is our right. That is our obligation. That is our duty." Well, that is evil. And that's there's a politician in the government, Andrew Hastie. He is an agent for that organization. In fact, in 2019, when he gave a speech comparing China to the Nazis, which was really controversial at the time, he made that speech in London at that organization's event, not in Australia. He made it in London, right? He's in the Liberal Party, which is the governing party. The Labor Party has a group of politicians called who are associated and members of the same Henry Jackson Society. The Labor Party ones and the Liberal Party ones got together and they called themselves the Wolverines, this little group. I talked about it on other shows on YouTube, and it's based on a 1985 movie where an American high school resists a commie takeover of America, right? And they're called the Wolverines, and it's a fantasy in their mind. They go and they're so juvenile. They take stickers of claw marks and they put them around the Parliament House to mark their territory. It's really, but these people the media paved the way for them. Every statement they made, they got all this prominence. They were deliberately provocative. The members of this group, which is I say their loyalty is to the United States and the United Kingdom, not to Australia. They control, Jing, our intelligence committee. So the Parliament has an intelligence committee that oversees the intelligence agencies, right? Without that oversight, those agencies are more powerful than the government because they get to do what they do in secret. So theoretically, Parliament oversight is quite important. Well, that committee that oversees the intelligence agencies is completely controlled by these pro-British, pro-American Wolverines. And what they did they would create scandals and lies about China, feed the media. The media would beat it out of all proportion. There was a book written in 2018 called Silent Invasion but we have a large Chinese diaspora in Australia, which is about 1.5 million people, or probably 2 million people. It's the largest ethnic group, the Chinese community here. This book said 30% of the Chinese community in Australia are loyal to Beijing. And the book was called Silent Invasion. And it scared Australians to death, right? Oh, this massive infiltration of us by the Chinese. And this was this intelligence committee, the media, they orchestrated the publicity for this book. They got it everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. And this was in 2018. Now, it coincided with Trump being president, right? And ultimately, that's what was happening. There was there's an organisation which is the worst participant in this whole picture in Australia called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI.
Yep.
It is majority funded by the Australian Defence Department, but outside of that, it gets a lot of other funding, and the main funding from the United States State Department and from the biggest weapons manufacturers in the world, like Lockheed Martin. And that organisation has pumped out all these lies about China nonstop, including the Uyghur genocide lies and all those sort of things, right? They have pumped it out and pumped it out and pumped it out, funded by the United States to do it.
Sorry, Robbie, I would just add something here because you mentioned the ASPI, the ASPI, and their founders. This think tank, they call themselves independent think tank, but actually they got money from several governments, and one of the biggest is U.S. State Department and UK Embassy in China, Embassy of the Kingdom of Netherlands, and together with Embassy of Israel, Embassy of Japan, so many governments and arms manufacturers, and they are the ones who basically all the lies about Xinjiang, about the so-called repression towards Uyghurs, all come from the same think tank, ASPI. But the funny thing is, they want to discredit us because we are somehow state-backed. But they are backed by several states. They're not telling people that. And actually, all the mainstream media journalists who discredit us because telling people we are not trustworthy because we work for the Chinese government somehow. But they are totally okay with quoting, using the research from this multiple governments sponsored think tank, which is quite hypocritical to me as well. But yeah, I just want to add some of that background here, but please continue.
No, we have a saying here in English anyway, irony is dead. in other words, the contradiction, when people can't see these contradictions, because this is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute funded by foreign governments, and they attack like these YouTubers, they're state backed. Well, you're state backed, buddy, and your state commits wars and has and those foreign companies that fund you profit from wars, and your whole role is to start wars. And in fact, there's just been a changing of the guard. We call it ASPI. We don't bother spelling out the name. We just call it ASPI. And I like calling it ASPI because asp is a snake, and that's what they are. They talk with a forked tongue, but their long-term director has been a man named Peter Jennings. He's retiring. He was the man who advised our government in 2003, the John Howard government. It was his advice that we should go to war in Iraq. And his reason for it is not because Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, not because Iraq was a threat to Australia, but because we've got to follow the United States. So that's who this man is, right? He's totally someone who salutes Uncle Sam. And so he's now retiring. Everything you've heard about ASPI in the last few years has been on his watch. So who are they going to replace him with? The new guy, his name's Justin Bassey, and a top American official from the National Security Council over there, Matthew Pottinger, has just given a ringing endorsement to this Justin Bassey and said Justin Bassey played the most important role in steering Australia's policy, Australia's strategic realignment, he said, in the last few years. And what he means by that is steering this sudden turn in Australia to be hostile to China. So the man who was credited for doing that from within the government, in the Prime Minister's office and in the Foreign Minister's office, is now going to be the new head of ASPI. That shows you how important ASPI is.
And what kind of cooperation, what kind of relationship between China and Australia that would benefit both countries and benefit people of both countries, in your opinion?
Go back to the one we had a few years ago to start and build on that, right? I mean, Xi Jinping came and addressed our parliament in 2015. We signed on paper, our two countries have a comprehensive strategic partnership. It's on paper. We haven't scrapped that yet. But we've got to change the rhetoric and change the attitude. And I think the single best thing to do would be for Australians to see the Belt and Road for what it is. That is the greatest opportunity for a developing of the relationship that won't be just with China, but with the whole world, because it's such a big visionary project. We could participate in that. We often joke. I have to give you this example. In it would have been 2013 or so. There was the man who now wants to be the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, was the Transportation Minister. And under him, his department produced a report about a fast train from Melbourne to Brisbane. So if you know Melbourne, where Sydney, it's along the east coast, right? And that's about a roughly 2,000 kilometre route, Melbourne to Brisbane. And the report said, well, this is going to take $104 billion to build, and 50 years, 5 decades, 50 years. And we said we should just invite the Chinese in to build it, right? If we want it built, let's get China. Look how fast China's building, 36,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. That was a joke. But if you're serious, it's not really a joke. What you would do is you would say, look, the Chinese have now an incredible capacity in infrastructure development. Yeah, we've got the manpower and materials. We're Australia. We're swimming in iron ore. Let's combine the two. Invite Chinese consultants, etc., down to help us. Let's have high-speed rail. Let's do it fast, right? Let's not whatever we were thinking of before. That's unacceptable. Let's do it. Let's do it fast so that Australia can enjoy the benefits of it. And if China has the expertise in that, let's bring them in. That said, Australia is a developed country. We're losing a lot because we don't have much manufacturing anymore, etc. We've got a lot of skills here. We can be contributing that to a Belt and Road perspective, right? What we also can do, and this is acutely important now, but it will benefit China and it will benefit the whole world. we can develop ourselves much more as a food bowl. Now, one of our favorite projects that we promote is for a fast train from Melbourne, not to Brisbane, but that we can do that as well. But one all the way through the middle of Australia to Darwin, that is for freight, more than passenger, a fast freight train. And we can get fresh fruit and vegetables that are grown in the southern part of Australia to Darwin in 24 hours. And then we should develop high-speed shipping. And Australia already has some of the best high-speed shipping manufacturing in the world in places like Perth, called Austell. In Tasmania, it's called Incat, catamarans. These are fast ships that can take this fresh produce that's got to Darwin in 24 hours, and it can be in Jakarta within less than a day, Singapore in a day, and even in Hong Kong and Shenzhen in a couple of days. And you can have a source of the freshest, cleanest, greenest agricultural product, right? That's reliable and it's grown in Australia. We could be developing that. We could build water projects that expand our food bowl. We've got a lot of land in this country. That's what we could be doing, but you need the infrastructure, right? And that's why the development of the Darwin port is so important. That can be our contribution to the Belt and Road perspective, right? We've got a lot of capacity, and Australia would benefit immensely from that, and the whole world our part of the world especially, would benefit from all that we can produce.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robbie, for your insights, for your efforts on building a friendly relationship between our countries. And I do hope we have you more on the show to share your views.
Thanks, Jing Jing. Happy to.